Just think of how many media headlines we've had about Madeleine McCann. Thousands over the last 8 years, probably more headlines than any other subject. And they haven't told you about Wojciech Krakowski.
The investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance took an entirely new direction with the introduction of two cadaver dogs, Eddie and Keela, a move that fundamentally challenged the prevailing abduction theory, which had been dominating both the media and public perception. Eddie was specifically trained to detect the scent of human remains, whilst Keela was a specialist in detecting human blood. Their combined presence marked an unprecedented shift in the case, raising the deeply unsettling possibility that Madeleine may have met her end within apartment 5A. What makes this shift so significant? Their involvement not only represented the very first time cadaver dogs were used in this investigation, but it also sent shockwaves through the true crime community. Here, the phrase "dogs don't lie, people do" became a powerful symbol of a growing suspicion and, indeed, outrage at what some saw as efforts to dismiss the dog's alerts. In a move that many found baffling, Kate and Gerry McCann, along with some investigators, hastily dismissed the value of Eddie and Keela's work. Was this a grave mistake born of panic, or something more calculated? It left the public wondering if they were truly innocent. Why not pursue the leads offered by animals that simply cannot lie? Are we witnessing Eddie and Keela, pointing towards the grim truth of Madeleine's fate? Or is this all part of a tragic and complex misunderstanding? Critically, why did the McCanns, instead of fully cooperating, choose to reject the findings of these highly trained dogs? These are the questions that lead us into a deeper investigation, where the truth still seems to hide in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. One point of intense focus was a spot where the cadaver dog marked, supported by Keela, the human blood-sniffing dog. It was here that blood was reportedly found underneath the floor tiles. How does one explain such a finding? An observation that observers found curious was that within a family of doctors, there were only 2 toothbrushes for 3 children, which led to a very specific and dark theory. Was it possible they used Madeleine's toothbrush with bleach to clean between the grout? The source of this theory pointed to the fact that blood was allegedly found under the tiles with a forensic profile of 15 out of 19 markers, which in some countries could be considered enough for a conviction, leading to the conclusion that the forensics tell us an accident likely happened behind that sofa. In the highly controversial Madeleine McCann case, these 2 specially trained sniffer dogs, Eddie and Keela, truly took center stage. Eddie's exceptional capability allowed him to detect the scent of human remains, also known as cadaver scent, just 1 to 2 hours after a person's passing. Notably, Eddie did not react to common odors such as garbage, food, or animal scents, and he was able to detect even the faintest traces of this specific scent, including those that had been thoroughly cleaned or concealed over time. Keela, Eddie's canine partner, was trained to detect human blood with extreme sensitivity, capable of identifying even microscopic traces after attempts to clean or conceal them. Is it credible that such specialist animals could both be wrong? Both dogs were trained by Martin Grime, a renowned expert in his field with involvement in over 200 major investigations. During their work on Madeleine's disappearance, Eddie and Keela generated a total of 17 alerts, each carrying significant implications that neither law enforcement nor the public could ignore. In apartment 5A, the dogs made 8 alerts in total. Behind the living room sofa, in a narrow area near the window, Eddie detected the scent of a cadaver, while Keela identified traces of human blood. This specific location raised suspicions of a possible accident, such as a fall or a violent impact. Adding to this, Eddie also alerted to the scent of a cadaver inside the wardrobe of the apartment. What made this finding so deeply suspicious was that no deaths had ever been reported in this location before. and only the McCann family had access to it. 5 additional alerts were recorded in the Renault Scenic car, which was rented by the McCanns 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. In the trunk of this vehicle, Eddie once again detected cadaver scent, while Keela found traces of human blood. The timing of the rental is crucial here. Could the discovery of a cadaver scent in the trunk truly be a coincidence? Or does it strongly suggest the car was used to transport or conceal Madeleine's body? 2 more alerts involved Cuddle Cat, Madeleine's beloved stuffed toy. Eddie indicated cadaver scent on the toy, but his behavior during this discovery was described as unusual. He sniffed, bit, and even tossed the toy into the air before finally marking it, and he only reacted decisively after the toy had been hidden. What could this intense and strange behavior signify? Many came to believe the toy must have been in close contact with Madeleine's body for a significant period. The final 2 alerts were linked directly to clothing belonging to Kate McCann, Madeleine's mother. Eddie detected cadaver scent on one of her shirts, while no alerts were triggered by the clothing of any other individuals. This finding inevitably raised additional, difficult suspicions that Kate might have come into direct contact with the body. Beyond the alerts themselves, video footage showing Eddie and Keela at work caused a major public stir. In the videos, Eddie is seen barking aggressively and alerting at both the sofa and the car trunk, while Keela stands still, signaling the presence of blood at the sofa. These videos circulated rapidly on YouTube and were viewed as compelling visual evidence, leading the public to place great faith in the dog's capabilities. From a scientific perspective, DNA samples collected from the trunk of the Renault Scenic provided another layer of complexity. They showed that 15 out of 19 genetic markers matched Madeleine's DNA. However, experts cautioned that the results were too complex to draw definitive conclusions, as the samples may have been contaminated. Though not strong enough for a legal prosecution, these DNA findings certainly added to the cloud of suspicion surrounding the family. Nevertheless, doubts about the dog's behavior persisted. An official report noted that Eddie had passed by the sofa and Cuddle Cat several times without immediately alerting, only reacting after these items were hidden. In particular, Eddie's biting and tossing of Cuddle Cat before marking it was viewed as highly unusual. Could this be a sign of fallibility? Some experts suggested that this behavior may have been influenced by the handler, specifically Martin Grime. Analysts also drew parallels to the TV show America's Top Dog, where trained dogs sometimes gave false responses due to pressure or unintentional cues from their handlers. Indeed, scientific studies have shown that detection dogs can be significantly influenced by handler expectations or accidental signaling. This sparked serious controversy and raised questions about the reliability of their findings. Eddie's unusual actions, such as passing key locations multiple times before marking, were flagged in official reports by Portuguese police and forensic experts who requested further clarification. Could his delayed reactions and atypical marking behavior indicate his responses were influenced, consciously or unconsciously, by his handler? This led to broader concerns about Martin Grime's role, who was in full control. While Grime's reputation as an expert with over 200 successful cases is well known, experts have raised red flags about how unconscious expectations or emotional tension from a handler can affect a dog's behavior. Scientific literature on animal behavior has long discussed this phenomenon, suggesting that dogs, despite training, are sensitive to subtle cues. In high-stakes cases, this effect can intensify, potentially leading to inaccurate results. Supporting this, a scientific study cited in the investigation revealed that a handler's attitude, emotional state, and physical behavior can profoundly impact a dog's performance, sometimes causing false positives or inconsistent reactions. Despite the ongoing controversy, the 17 alerts made by Eddie and Keela remain one of the most striking and debated pieces of evidence in the history of missing persons investigations. This was further illustrated in the widely viewed television program, America's Top Dog, where even highly trained police dogs were shown to occasionally fail or behave unpredictably when their handlers displayed nervousness or stress. The program highlighted how canine responses can be significantly altered by subtle factors such as body language, tone of voice, or the stress levels of the handler, particularly in high-pressure circumstances. In the context of the Madeleine McCann case, where global media attention was relentless and the stakes were higher than almost any comparable investigation, it is entirely plausible that Martin Grime, like any handler under intense pressure, could have inadvertently influenced the dog's responses. Beyond the possibility of unintentional handler influence, several additional issues contributed to doubts surrounding the reliability of the dog's behavior. The immense publicity of the case created extraordinary pressure on everyone involved, including Grime himself. Could such stress have eroded objectivity, perhaps leading to subtle, unconscious signals during searches? Some video footage even prompted speculation, as observers noted small gestures, vocal changes, or movements that might have influenced the animals. Critics suggested Grime may have either inadvertently or deliberately directed the dogs, with the most glaring concern being Eddie's repeated behavior of passing over specific locations several times before finally marking them. In most other investigations, detection dogs typically respond immediately upon identifying a target scent, so Eddie's delayed responses struck many as unusual. Did this pattern point to subconscious influence, or is there another explanation? Such behavior, considered atypical for highly trained detection dogs, quickly became a focal point for skeptics who questioned the legitimacy of the results. Yet public opinion remains divided. Supporters of Eddie and Kyla argue their performance should not be dismissed, emphasizing that they gave 17 alerts at highly relevant locations directly associated with the McCanns, places where no previous record of cadaver scent had ever existed. Could so many alerts all be coincidental? Supporters also highlight Martin Grime's long and proven track record, arguing that his expertise and past successes lend credibility to the findings. They point to the dog's specialized training, the specificity of the alerts, and the absence of any history of such scents in those areas as evidence that the results are unlikely to be explained solely by handler bias. On the other hand, many forensic experts and members of the true crime community contend that this case is a textbook example of unconscious handler influence. They argue that the unusual behavior of the dogs, particularly the delayed reactions and the peculiar interactions with items such as cuddle cat, strongly suggests the animals may have been guided, knowingly or not, by their handlers' expectations. For these critics, the unusual circumstances of the alerts, coupled with video evidence showing potentially suggestive handler behavior, raise serious doubts about reliability. Could the possibility of false positives through unconscious human influence really be ignored, especially in a case as complex and emotionally charged as Madeleine's? Ultimately, the debate over Eddie and Kyla's role remains unresolved, highlighting the importance of greater scrutiny and objectivity when evaluating canine evidence in serious investigations. Where traditional evidence is lacking or compromised, forensic scent detection has been used as a powerful yet controversial tool, particularly in the form of cadaver dogs. These highly trained animals are not merely reacting to general odors. They are detecting chemical compounds released during decomposition, specifically volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. When a human body undergoes natural breakdown, it emits a complex mixture of VOCs into the surrounding environment. These compounds, produced through cellular changes and bacterial activity, include molecules such as putrescine and dimethyl disulfide. What makes dogs like Eddie unique is their ability to detect even minute traces of these compounds, sometimes long after a body is no longer present. Studies have shown that these scent molecules bind to porous materials such as textiles, upholstery, and plastics, and can persist even after extensive cleaning. This science is particularly relevant to the McCann case. Eddie alerted to multiple items, including the back of a sofa, a wardrobe, the boot of a Renault Scenic, and Madeleine's toy cuddle cat. Critics have questioned how such scents could linger in the absence of a body. Yet research in both the United States and Europe confirms VOCs can remain detectable for weeks or months, depending on environmental conditions and cleaning practices. Controlled experiments have shown cadaver dogs identifying traces on clothing more than 60 days after brief exposure. Environmental factors such as temperature and airflow affect the strength of these scents, but sealed or poorly ventilated spaces, like a car interior or a wardrobe, can preserve them more effectively. Could this explain why Eddie signaled at the car boot 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance? Unless one assumes deliberate manipulation, a claim unsupported by evidence, the only plausible explanation is the previous presence of decomposition compounds. Supporting Eddie's role was Keela, trained to detect human blood. Even after cleaning, blood leaves behind biological markers such as heme, iron, and amino acids, which remain chemically active even if invisible to the human eye. Crime scene experts have documented cases where blood residues undetectable by chemical sprays or UV light were still located by dogs like Keela, leading to breakthroughs. In the McCann case, Keela's alerts to the same areas as Eddie, particularly behind the sofa and inside the car boot, provided corroboration that both a decompositional process and traces of blood may have been present in the same locations. Scientific analysis has shown that even the tiniest speck of dried blood can remain detectable long after washing, especially on fabrics or car upholstery. Unlike humans, these dogs do not rely on visual evidence, but detect scent signatures embedded at the molecular level. Skeptics are right to point out that cadaver dog alerts are not infallible and should not, on their own, form the sole basis of conviction. But does forensic science ever claim perfection? The strength of this type of evidence lies in its consistency, specificity, and the context of where alerts occur. Eddie and Keila gave 17 alerts in total, most of them tied directly to the McCann's environment. None were random or in irrelevant places. Internationally, courts vary in their treatment of such evidence. In the United States, alerts may justify further investigation or warrants. In the United Kingdom, they are admissible when supported by other findings. And in Portugal, where this investigation took place, courts are often more cautious, but still allow consideration when combined with supporting evidence such as partial DNA matches or inconsistencies in witness timelines. What strengthens the case here is the overlap of multiple indicators: canine alerts, partial DNA results in the car, unusual behavioral patterns, and the absence of any credible evidence pointing towards an external abduction. In forensic science, this overlap is known as multi-source corroboration. No single element proves guilt, but when several independent clues align, their weight cannot be easily dismissed. Other case studies support this. In the high-profile Casey Anthony trial in the United States, a cadaver dog's alert to the boot of a vehicle played a central role, even though no body was found. In Canada, during the Christine Jessup case, a cadaver dog located remains in an area that human teams had already searched. Around the world, numerous missing persons cases have been redirected because of alerts from trained dogs. Critics sometimes point to rare false alerts, such as the Zapata case, which Gerry McCann himself cited in defense. Yet once all evidence came to light, investigators confirmed the dog had in fact been accurate. Quoting such examples without full context risks distorting the scientific foundation of scent detection. Viewed through a forensic lens, the McCann case shows not random or inconsistent behavior, but targeted and repeated alerts concentrated solely on objects and areas linked directly to the family. No alerts were recorded in places linked to strangers or hotel staff. No other apartments, no public spaces. Only their apartment, their car, their possessions, and their clothing. This evidence does not in itself prove responsibility, but it does form a compelling basis for further inquiry. In many investigations, dog alerts are treated not as conclusions, but as starting points for deeper examination. And in this case, the trail uncovered has yet to be fully explained, much less convincingly refuted. In any inquiry into the unexplained disappearance of a child, the timeline and behavior of those closest become an essential point of reference. The initial 30 days following a person's disappearance are often the most revealing, not because parents are presumed guilty by default, but because genuine grief is incredibly difficult to fabricate, and inconsistencies are far easier to detect when emotions are raw. In the case of Kate and Gerry McCann, the timeline following Madeleine's disappearance presents a sequence that is not only meticulously documented, but is also riddled with strategic decisions, calculated appearances, and choices that seem to point more toward image management than the unfiltered agony of loss. Let us examine this period. On May 3, 2007, the night Madeleine was reported missing from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, the timeline shows that within minutes, the McCanns and their friends initiated a search, not just for evidence, but for explanations. Crucially, they contacted not only local authorities, but also media representatives and the British consulate. Is this unusual in itself? Perhaps not. But what stands out is the early and deliberate involvement of media handlers, a role which would grow in importance in the days that followed. By May 4th, just one day after Madeleine's disappearance, Kate and Gerry had already begun crafting a public narrative. In interviews, they described an abduction scenario despite the lack of any signs of forced entry, no fingerprints on the window shutters, and no eyewitness accounts of a break-in. Rather than expressing uncertainty or a plea for any information, their statements projected absolute conviction. It was not a desperate, "we don't know what happened," but a definitive, "she was taken." This early certainty would come to define the McCann media strategy: confident, controlled, and emotionally restrained. Within 5 days, the couple made a decision that would alter the course of public perception entirely. They hired public relations consultants to manage their message. By mid-May, the McCanns had entered into contracts with Justine McGuinness, a political PR figure with no background in child recovery or criminal communication. What does the choice of such a specialist suggest about their priorities? The objective, it seemed, was not to assist in finding Madeleine, but to manage optics. Even more striking is that within 3 weeks, they engaged the services of Carter Ruck, one of the UK's most aggressive libel law firms. Known for representing politicians, oligarchs, and celebrities, Carter Ruck specializes not in uncovering truth, but in shutting down criticism. For a grieving family, the choice of such a firm so early, and with no public accusations of guilt yet made against them, was a profound anomaly. It raised critical questions. Why was so much energy being placed on controlling the narrative, silencing skeptics, and preemptively managing press coverage rather than on cooperating fully with investigators? In parallel, inconsistencies began to emerge between the McCanns' public statements and their private actions. In one early interview, Gerry stated, "We will leave no stone unturned." Yet police records indicate that the McCanns were reluctant to submit themselves to reenactments, declined lie detector tests, and resisted key requests by Portuguese investigators. including a reconstruction of the night of May 3rd. Another contradiction lies in their description of their movements. Publicly, the McCanns stated that they remained close to the investigation in Praia da Luz to aid the police. Privately, however, records show they made several trips, both within Portugal and abroad, beginning just days after the disappearance. One of the earliest involved travel to Fatima, a Catholic pilgrimage site. While this may seem spiritually motivated, critics argue it aligned more with public sympathy optics than investigative necessity. More alarming was their eventual return to the UK on September 9, 2007, shortly after being declared arguidos, formal suspects, by Portuguese authorities. Their departure was framed as a necessity for emotional recovery, but the timing, immediately after their legal status changed, raised questions of a flight from legal vulnerability. The fact that they left Portugal without facing further questioning only cemented suspicions among both local investigators and the international public. Even small behavioral cues became subjects of debate. Footage shows Kate McCann repeatedly avoiding direct eye contact in interviews, clutching Cuddle Cat in early appearances, then later washing the toy after it was flagged by cadaver dogs. In the language of behavioral forensics, are such shifts ever random? They can reflect a calculated disengagement from emotionally dangerous material. Gerry, conversely, often adopted a more clinical tone in interviews, referring to Madeleine's disappearance in passive procedural language. Their emotional flatness, particularly in moments where spontaneous anguish might be expected, contributed to the growing sense that this was less a parental tragedy and more a public relations campaign. One particularly telling inconsistency arose during media questioning. When asked about the lack of DNA or physical evidence of an abduction, Gerry responded dismissively, "Whoever took her was very clean." Yet, how does this offhand remark stand up to logical scrutiny? A clean abduction with no noise, no fingerprints, no hair, no signs of struggle, and no reliable sighting of a stranger exiting the complex defies not only forensic likelihood, but also common sense. Meanwhile, the McCanns launched the Find Madeleine Fund, which was publicly positioned as a non-profit initiative. However, later scrutiny revealed that the fund was a private limited company, not a registered charity, allowing the family greater control over disbursement and legal strategy. This financial decision, again made within the first month, underscored a pattern of early legal structuring and media filtering rather than investigative transparency. In sum, the first 30 days of the McCanns' behavior reflect a convergence of PR maneuvering, legal fortification, and emotional restraint. Forensic psychologists describe this as preemptive innocence projection, a behavior pattern where individuals, fearing accusation, construct a narrative of blamelessness so thoroughly and so early that it undermines their credibility. Genuine grief is disorganized, raw, and unpredictable. What was observed here, many argue, was not grief, but strategy. By overlaying this behavioral timeline with forensic findings, such as the 17 canine alerts and the partial DNA match in the rental car, we gain not just a physical map of the case, but a psychological roadmap. The McCanns' every move in those early weeks appears designed not for clarity, but for control, not for cooperation, but for containment. And as the days passed, what they said and what they did increasingly became two very different stories. In the intricate web of events surrounding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, several behaviors displayed by her parents have drawn scrutiny from investigators, forensic experts, and the broader true crime community. These behaviors, often subtle yet symbolically potent, have become central to debates about potential concealment, uncooperative conduct, or simply psychological responses to extreme trauma. Each action must be examined in context, not with a presumption of guilt, but through the lens of logic, behavioral analysis, and evidentiary consistency. One of the earliest behaviors that raised eyebrows was Kate McCann's decision to wash Madeleine's beloved toy, Cuddle Cat. The timing was striking. This occurred shortly after the cadaver dog Eddie alerted to the toy, indicating the scent of human decomposition. Cuddle Cat was not just a toy. It had become a highly personal emotional symbol. Kate was seen clutching it constantly in interviews and public appearances, using it almost like a surrogate for her daughter's presence. To then clean such an emotionally significant item so soon after a scent detection puzzled many in an investigative context. Was this action interpreted as an act of hygiene or coping, or could it be seen as a potential attempt to remove evidence? Critics argued that a parent desperate to retain the memory of their missing child would not so readily sanitize the one object that embodied that connection, especially one that had just been flagged by a trained cadaver dog. While there is no law against such an action, and grief manifests differently for everyone, the decision to wash Cuddle Cat remains one of the most discussed and symbolically charged choices in the case. Gerry McCann likewise displayed behaviors that drew concern, particularly in how he addressed the dog's scent alerts. At one point, he cited the Zapata case as an example of canine error to question the reliability of scent detection. Yet this reference was inaccurate because the suspect later confessed, and the dog's indication was validated, which led some to feel he was undermining the dog's credibility by invoking a faulty precedent. In forensic psychology, attempts to discredit evidence without a solid factual basis are often viewed as warning signs, especially when made by individuals under scrutiny. Was this a simple mistake under pressure, or a calculated deflection? And did it end up casting doubt not on the dog's, but on Gerry's own reliability? Another much-quoted moment was his remark, "Why don't you just ask the dogs?" A line that many found flippant in a context so charged with emotion and legal attention. Sarcasm under stress does not in itself imply guilt, but in a case where every word was weighed, did this response sound defensive and diminish the seriousness of the inquiry? More formally, a major act of non-cooperation occurred during Kate McCann's interview with Portuguese police, when she declined to answer 48 specific questions focused on the night of Madeleine's disappearance, the layout of the apartment, and interactions among the group. Legally, she was entitled to remain silent, yet investigators often look for openness from those closest to a victim. Did this strategic silence project avoidance and affect perceptions of transparency, even if it cannot be used to assign guilt? A separate point of curiosity arose from reports by neighbors and resort residents that the Renault Scenic, hired 24 days after Madeleine went missing, was left with its boot open on many nights. This drew attention because both dogs had signaled at the boot, one for scents associated with remains and the other for traces of human blood. And in forensic analysis, an open boot may suggest an attempt to air or dissipate lingering odors, particularly those linked to decomposition. Was there a benign explanation the public never fully heard, or did this detail, combined with a partial DNA profile of 15 out of 19 markers consistent with Madeleine, reasonably elevate concern about the car's role? Police reports also indicated that certain items of furniture in apartment 5A appeared to have been moved between the time of the disappearance and the later dog searches, most notably the sofa, one of the areas where the scent detection dog indicated, which showed signs of displacement. Investigators noted subtle discrepancies in the room's layout that suggested someone might have rearranged or cleaned the space. And in forensic terms, alterations after the fact are considered highly suspicious, though they can also stem from innocent cleaning or understandable anxiety. How should we interpret timing, context, and proximity when they cluster around a focal area? Taken singly, these behaviors could be read in multiple ways. some benign, others more concerning. But when evaluated together, they form a pattern that diverges from what is typically observed in cases involving missing children, from the emotional symbolism of cleaning a cherished toy to misrepresenting prior case law, from silence during key questioning to unexplained practices around a hire car. While no single act is proof of wrongdoing, the cumulative effect has undeniably shaped public perception and investigative direction. In situations where direct evidence is limited, behavioral analysis becomes crucial, and here it raises more questions than answers. In the absence of conclusive physical proof, how much weight should be given to actions, timing, and tone? In the realm of complex investigations, behavior itself becomes part of the evidential picture, and in Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the conduct of Kate and Gerry has consistently attracted attention from law enforcement, psychologists, forensic analysts, and the wider true crime community. Examined through a forensic psychology lens, these responses have been read by some as markers of defensive posture, containment strategies, and psychological dissonance rather than unfiltered grief or urgent desperation, appearing at times calculated, curated, and counterintuitive. To understand this, consider the concept of defensive behavior. It is not merely emotional pushback, but often an indicator of internal conflict when individuals are trying to maintain a public image that may not align with private knowledge. In this context, Kate's refusal to answer 48 critical questions can be seen not just as a legal choice, but as strategic silence, an effort to avoid potentially self-incriminating material, which in investigative psychology is a red flag, because an innocent parent desperate for answers rarely declines to participate in processes that could clarify the truth. Though, of course, legal advice and trauma responses complicate this picture. This avoidance appears more troubling when considered alongside decisions that resemble what psychologists call covering tracks, preemptive actions to erase, obscure, or modify elements that might point towards responsibility, with prominent examples including the washing of Cuddle Cat, an intensely symbolic object, immediately after a dog had indicated scent traces, which suggests not only emotional sanitizing, but potentially forensic sanitizing as well. In forensic terms, that looks less like a misjudged coping mechanism and more like intent to alter trace evidence. Another action often cited in this profile is repeatedly leaving open the boot of the Renault Scenic, a location where both dogs signaled and where a partial DNA profile consistent with Madeleine was later reported. Since forensic analysts theorize that open-air exposure could disperse or reduce scent signatures linked to decomposition. In behavioral profiling, actions lacking reasonable everyday explanations yet correlating with potential evidence alteration are rarely dismissed as coincidence. These examples converge on a framework of over-control, the tendency of individuals under extreme pressure to compensate for inner turmoil by exerting high control over their environment, not through overt aggression, but via cleaning, reorganizing, or recontextualizing physical spaces. Does this pattern reflect understandable attempts to cope, or does it indicate a managed narrative in which optics and containment took precedence over spontaneous transparency? The rearrangement of furniture within apartment 5A after the initial police examination fits this pattern precisely, with particular attention on the area near the sofa where a trained dog had indicated scent traces, which appeared to have been disturbed in a way that suggested a conscious attempt to alter the impression of what may have occurred there. In the field of criminal psychology, such behavior is seldom dismissed as coincidental. Altering a potential scene of significance is viewed as highly suspicious, usually driven by the knowledge or fear that something revealing might remain. These inconsistencies become even more striking when considered alongside verbal cues. Gerry McCann's sarcastic comment, "Why don't you just ask the dogs?" when questioned about the alerts, did not strike many observers as the words of a distraught father, but rather as a deflection, an attempt to emotionally distance himself from the findings. Sarcasm in high-stress situations is often used as a defense mechanism, a way of taking control of the conversation, diminishing the weight of difficult evidence or trivializing uncomfortable implications. Psychologists describe this as minimization, an attempt to downplay severity, cast doubt, or dismiss relevance. Instead of addressing the unsettling implications of the dog's alerts, the remark reframed the evidence as absurd, even laughable. Was this simply stress-induced flippancy, or a deliberate tactic to reframe the narrative? This tone not only risked undermining the seriousness of the investigation, but also suggested a defensive stance that conflicted with what one might expect from an innocent parent urgently seeking the truth. Beneath such behaviors lies a deeper psychological tension, often explained by the concept of cognitive dissonance, which occurs when a person holds conflicting internal positions, such as privately knowing uncomfortable facts while publicly presenting a carefully managed image of innocence. The strain of such contradiction often reveals itself in controlled emotions, inconsistent actions, or decisions that seem erratic when viewed from the outside. In this case, the public face presented by the McCanns, composed, strategic, and media-savvy, stands in stark contrast to the unexplained behaviors catalogued during the inquiry. The result is a fractured psychological profile, one shaped less by the rawness of trauma and more by the deliberate choreography of control. Consider the behavioral comparisons with other parents of missing children. In many such cases, parents display spontaneous emotion, insist on exhaustive investigations, and hold on to items that symbolize their connection to their child. They do not rush to sanitize belongings, they do not question the methods of detection dogs, and they rarely decline to answer investigators' questions. Instead, they seek answers and encourage every possible lead. The McCanns, however, displayed a markedly different spectrum of behavior, one that seemed less about unfiltered grief and more about strategy. It is vital to acknowledge that psychological profiling is not proof of guilt. It is an investigative tool, helping to interpret behaviors, identify patterns, and recognize deviations from typical responses. Yet when multiple behaviors consistently point towards defensive silence, calculated sarcasm, manipulation of the environment, and symbolic erasure, it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss such patterns as innocent quirks of grief. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that none of these actions require proof of wrongdoing to be concerning. In cases where there is no body, no confession, and no conclusive forensic evidence, behavior itself becomes a form of evidence. And in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, the actions documented over time, across settings, and in varied contexts, align more with a strategy of concealment than with transparent cooperation. When viewed through the lens of forensic psychology, the McCanns' actions present a troubling picture. From the erasure of potential scent traces to the avoidance of direct questioning, from managing their public narrative to displaying defensive and overly controlled responses. What emerges is not so much what was said, but what was done. And in psychology, actions often speak louder than words. If the alerts from Eddie and Keela were accurate, then the focus on Christian Bruckner as the prime suspect becomes increasingly tenuous. These dogs, trained by one of the UK's most experienced handlers, do not speculate. They respond only to biological realities, identifying traces of decomposition and human blood. In this case, they alerted multiple times across different locations, each one directly associated with the McCanns, from the living area in apartment 5A to Kate McCann's clothing, from Madeleine's toy to the boot of the rental car. Not a single alert pointed toward Bruckner. He was never known to have entered the apartment, had no access to the belongings in question, and did not use the vehicle. No scent, no trace, no indication of his presence was detected at any of the sites where the dogs reacted. This leads to a simple but powerful conclusion. If Madeleine died within the apartment, as the dog's indications strongly suggest, then Bruckner could not have been the one responsible, for he was never there. His absence is not merely a gap in the evidence, it is a form of forensic exclusion. The dogs did not miss him. They had nothing to detect because he left behind nothing at the level they were trained to find. In investigations, dog alerts are not definitive proof on their own, but nor are they meaningless. Their presence points to something, and their absence points to someone not being involved. To maintain the theory of Bruckner's responsibility requires either rejecting the dog's reliability altogether or proposing an implausible scenario in which he orchestrated events in a space he never entered, with objects he never touched, leaving no detectable trace. That is not a theory grounded in evidence. It is a stretch of imagination. Once the dog's alerts are accepted as valid, the structure of suspicion shifts. To ignore this is to cling to a suspect based on image, criminal history, or convenience rather than forensic fact. And even proximity, often cited in his case, proves little. Praia da Luz was a tourist destination filled with visitors, workers, and residents. Simply being nearby does not equal involvement. Having a disturbing past does not equate to guilt in this specific case. To be clear, this does not absolve Bruckner of other offenses he may have committed. But guilt here must rest on what can be proven. And after years of international investigation, no forensic evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no digital traces has ever linked him to Madeleine. Even the phone call once hailed as a breakthrough amounted only to proximity, and proximity alone, especially in a tourist hub, is not proof. This silence in the forensic record speaks volumes. As for the so-called confessions, they remain vague and second-hand. One alleged claim of knowing what happened to Madeleine came years later from a former acquaintance, with no recording or corroboration. In legal terms, that is hearsay, not hard proof. The German prosecution has often expressed strong belief in Christian Bruckner's guilt, yet belief is not a substitute for evidence. The fact that charges have still not been filed, despite him being named a formal suspect since 2020, underlines this gap. Here we see the danger, confusing a pattern with a person. A man may fit the profile of a predator, but that does not automatically make him the perpetrator in this case. Justice requires more than unsettling similarities. It requires a direct link to the crime. Being near is not being inside, and in any fair system, proximity is not enough. This is not to say Bruckner should be dismissed entirely. His background deserves scrutiny, his movements warrant investigation. But building a case on inference, instinct, and reputation without tangible evidence risks both justice and truth. Because if he is not responsible, and all focus remains on him, the real answers are pushed further into the shadows, giving the true culprit more time, more distance, and more silence. That is the danger of pursuing a suspect who fits the story, but not the scene. Without the alerts from the dogs, what remains is precisely that, a story, not a case. And here lies the paradox at the heart of Madeleine McCann's disappearance. No theory resolves it without contradiction. If the dogs were correct, then she died in apartment 5A, and the events that followed must involve people within her immediate circle. That would completely remove Bruckner from suspicion, because the very evidence pointing to death in specific locations also confines the case to a space he never entered. But if the dogs were mistaken, and all 17 alerts dismissed as error, then the entire weight of the case must rest on Bruckner alone, and that foundation is too fragile to hold. The two dominant investigative paths, death in the apartment or an external abduction, are mutually exclusive. The stronger the case for the dogs, the weaker the suspicion against Bruckner. The stronger the suspicion against him, the weaker the case for the dogs. Yet the public narrative has long tried to hold both, seeking certainty from contradiction. It wants to believe the dogs were accurate, while also believing that Bruckner is the one to blame. But both cannot be true. We cannot place Madeleine's death inside a tightly controlled family space, and simultaneously argue that a stranger with no access, no contact, and no trace is responsible. The investigation has walked this impossible line for years, pressed by politics, media, and the hunger for closure. The result is investigative limbo, progress paralyzed, questions piling higher than answers. The McCanns, once suspects, now sit behind the shield of presumption of innocence, reinforced by legal and public support. Bruckner, meanwhile, remains under suspicion, but uncharged. And at the center lies a child whose story is clouded by conflicting narratives. Each time the case leans one way, it risks collapsing the other. What is needed is the courage to choose. Either the dogs were right, and the focus must return inward, or the dogs were wrong, and the case against Bruckner must be rebuilt on solid, independent evidence. Pretending both can be true only deepens the contradiction. Truth cannot be in two places at once. Until that is faced, Madeleine's case will remain not just unresolved, but trapped in a fog of contradiction. More than an investigation, it has become a lesson in how truth can be buried beneath competing stories, how evidence can be sidelined, and how advanced forensic tools can be ignored when they do not fit a chosen narrative. If anything, the case leaves not closure, but caution. Dogs, such as Eddie and Keela, represent one of the strongest tools in modern forensic search. They do not rely on testimony or theory. They respond to biological reality. Their alerts in this case provided some of the only direct physical clues. Yet those alerts require careful follow-up. DNA testing, chemical analysis, independent verification. Here, the follow-up fell short. The DNA results were inconclusive, the sites not properly preserved, the cooperation between authorities inconsistent. What should have opened doors became instead a matter of dispute. The risk of misinterpretation is real. Dogs can be influenced, consciously or not, by their handlers. Studies and field trials show how subtle cues, body language, or tension can shape a dog's reaction. That is why double-blind setups and objective analysis are crucial. In this case, although filmed, the alerts were dismissed too quickly, without rigorous counter-evidence, which itself sets a dangerous precedent. Much of the public suspicion around Kate and Gerry McCann did not begin with forensic science, but with behavior. Kate washed Cuddlecat, the toy her daughter reportedly carried daily, shortly after it was flagged by a detection dog. She declined to answer 48 out of 49 police questions. Gerry mocked the dog's role, referencing failed cases rather than engaging with the evidence in their own. These choices may have explanations, but they undeniably raised questions. Parents of missing children are expected to grasp at every clue, to welcome any possible lead. The McCanns did the opposite when it came to the dogs, and that contradiction fueled doubt. This is not about declaring guilt or innocence. It is about recognizing that behavior shapes perception, influences investigators, and can decide whether leads are pursued or ignored. When parents dismiss potential evidence, the reaction is never neutral. Whether fair or not, it changes how their role in the story is seen. That reality cannot be overlooked. And finally, we must not forget the role of the public. Millions have followed this case for over a decade, Some analyze evidence, others cling to narrative, and many form strong, immovable opinions. But justice cannot be built on popularity. The moment public opinion replaces due process, the real truth risks being lost, just as it has been here, where suspicion and contradiction have overwhelmed clarity. And so, we reach a deadlock. If the dogs were right, Bruckner is excluded. If the dogs were wrong, no other evidence ties anyone else. The suspects are named, but the evidence does not follow. The media tells different stories, investigators point in different directions, and Madeleine has still not been found. Perhaps the lesson here is that consistency must matter more than comfort. Belief cannot replace proof. Until the same standard is applied evenly to all, this case will remain where it has been for years, unresolved, suspended between fact and speculation. The truth, whatever it may be, still waits. Now I want to ask you, after hearing these contradictions, how do you feel about this case? Do you believe the investigation has been led astray by focusing on the wrong suspect, or that crucial evidence has been overlooked? If you were in charge, would you follow the dog's alerts, or dismiss them and pursue Bruckner more aggressively? And most importantly, what do you think must happen next for Madeleine's story to finally move from confusion toward clarity?